scratching of pens on paper. Everyone was waiting for the next witness to be brought in, but no one paid attention to the smallest person in the room, a fragile-looking 9-year-old girl sitting on the wooden bench beside a large, disciplined German Shepherd police dog named Valor. Her feet didn't touch the floor, her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes, deep, quiet, and older than her years, watched everything with a kind of fear she tried desperately to hide. No one noticed how tightly she held the dog's vest, or how much she depended on the steady rise and fall of his breathing. No one except the dog himself, who remained perfectly still, watching the room with sharp intelligence. People knew him as a K-9 officer. The little girl knew him as her protector, her friend, and the only one in the world who had never broken a promise. The judge, an older man with silver hair and stern eyes, glanced over his glasses at the little girl occasionally, not unkindly but with the weight of someone who had seen too many broken families and far too many stories that ended badly. He hoped today would be different. He prayed it would, but experience had taught him that life rarely arranged itself around what people hoped. The prosecutor shuffled his papers. The defense attorney whispered to his client. The bailiff crossed his arms. And the little girl kept her hand buried in Valor's fur, trying to swallow her fear. Her name was Lily Carson, though everyone called her Lily Rose, because her mother used to say she had a heart that could root itself in hard soil and still find a way to bloom. But her mother was gone now, and Lily had learned very young that the world could be loud and cruel and filled with shadows that refused to disappear. Valor had been assigned to her after the night she was found shaking behind a dumpster, too terrified to speak, refusing to let any human hand come near her. But the dog had approached slowly, lowered his head gently, and simply sat beside her. She had slid her tiny hand toward his paw, and from that moment forward, they belonged to each other. Today, she was in court because she was the only witness to something terrible, something no child should have ever seen. Everyone agreed that she shouldn't have been forced to testify, but the case was impossible without her. Even with the dog trained to comfort her, even with specialists beside her, Lily hadn't spoken a single word since the night it happened. Whenever she tried, her voice disappeared and her lungs tightened as though the darkness from that night were still wrapped around her ribs. The judge sighed heavily, tapping his pen. "Ms. Carson," he said gently, "if you're ready, we can begin." Lily didn't lift her head. Her fingers twisted around Valor's vest. The dog nudged her knee with his snout, sensing her panic rising like a tide, but even then she couldn't force the words to come. She could barely breathe, much less speak. The prosecutor took a step forward, careful not to get too close. "Lily," he said softly, "you're safe here. No one will hurt you. Valor is right beside you. Can you tell us what you saw that night?" Her throat tightened painfully. A flash of memory, boots stomping, a scream, her mother falling, rushed through her like fire. She squeezed her eyes shut as tears burned behind them. The courtroom blurred. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Every adult watched her expectantly, unaware that she felt like she was drowning. Valor leaned closer, pressing his chest to her legs. But even that didn't stop her trembling. Minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The air grew heavy with disappointment. The defense attorney whispered to his client, a man with cold, shadowed eyes who glared at Lily with a look she recognized too well. He had threatened her once. He would do it again if he got free. She knew he would. She felt the terror creeping up again. She needed help, needed to say something before she froze completely. But she couldn't speak, not with her voice, so she used the only language she still trusted. She lifted her shaking hand and made a tiny, deliberate movement, an almost invisible twitch with two fingers, brushing Valor's shoulder twice in a coded pattern she had practiced with him countless nights when fear made sleep impossible. A hidden signal. Valor stiffened instantly. The judge noticed the dog's sudden alertness and leaned forward. Something was wrong. "Everyone stop," he commanded sharply. The entire courtroom froze. The prosecutors paused. The defense attorney lifted his head. The bailiff uncrossed his arms and stepped closer to the judge's bench. "What is the dog responding to?" the judge asked, voice calm but firm. Valor stood up slowly, placing himself directly in front of Lily, body rigid and eyes locked on the defendant. It was subtle, but those who understood dogs knew that Valor wasn't protecting her from fear, he was protecting her from a threat. The judge's voice dropped lower. Bailiff, detain the defendant immediately. The defendant jumped to his feet. What? On what grounds? But Valor barked. A single, deep, thunderous bark that echoed so loudly that the walls seemed to vibrate. Lily flinched, but she didn't cry. She kept her eyes closed, trusting Valor completely. The bailiff and two officers rushed forward, grabbing the defendant as he tried to step back. A small object slipped from his sleeve and hit the floor, a sharpened metal pin, small but lethal. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge slammed his gavel. Court is in emergency recess. The officers dragged the defendant out while he shouted protests that no one listened to. The prosecutor wiped sweat from his brow, shaken. The judge leaned back in his chair, hand pressed to his chest, trying to calm the adrenaline surging through him. Someone approached Lily, but Valor growled softly, not at them, but at the idea that anyone might crowd or overwhelm her. He stayed her shield until the judge himself stood up from the bench and slowly descended the steps. He knelt in front of Lily. "Lily," he said softly, voice trembling, "you just saved every person in this room." Her lip quivered. Tears dripped down her chin. Valor nudged her arm gently, reminding her she wasn't alone. She lifted her gaze for the first time since entering the courtroom. Her eyes were full of pain, but also something else, courage she didn't know she had. The judge spoke again, this time with a softness that cracked through the courtroom's professional walls. "You didn't need to say a single word. You already told us everything." Lily blinked, confused. "You told us," the judge said, "that your fear is real. That the threat was real. And that this dog, your dog, knows the truth of what happened that night." Valor sat beside her again, leaning gently into her side, pressing his weight into her to anchor her to the present moment. The judge reached out slowly, giving Lily plenty of time to pull away. She didn't. He placed his hand gently over hers. "What you did today," he whispered, "took more bravery than most grown men possess in their lifetime." The courtroom, once cold and formal, felt suddenly warm, bathed in the unspoken understanding that something bigger than evidence had just taken place. A child had spoken through trust, instinct, and courage. And a dog had listened. The judge stood and addressed everyone. "This court will provide Lily with full protection. The defendant's bail is revoked. And this case will move forward with new charges." The prosecutor nodded respectfully. The defense attorney remained silent, face pale. As officers escorted Lily out of the room, Valor walked proudly beside her, head high, each step measured and protective. People began to whisper, not out of doubt or disbelief, but out of awe. They had witnessed something extraordinary, the unbreakable bond between a broken child and a loyal dog who carried her pieces with the devotion of a soldier. Outside the courtroom, Lily sat on a wooden bench in the hallway, leaning against Valor. She breathed slowly, deeply, letting the fear drain out of her one breath at a time. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to speak, not to the adults, not to the lawyers, but to the dog who had never once asked her for anything except trust. "Thank you," she whispered. Valor nudged her shoulder, then placed his head gently on her lap. His eyes closed, but his ears remained alert, always listening, always ready. A victim advocate sat beside her quietly. "Lily," she said softly, "do you know what the judge told me just now? He said you reminded him that bravery doesn't always look like loud voices and confident speeches. Sometimes it looks like a tiny girl who refuses to let fear win." Lily didn't look up, but her fingers stroked Valor's fur, slowly, calmly. "I wasn't brave," she murmured. The advocate smiled. "You were brilliant." Lily shook her head. "Valor was brave for me." The advocate nodded gently. "Yes, but he only knew what to do because you trusted him. That takes a different kind of courage." Lily hesitated, then whispered, "Is it over now?" The advocate placed a hand over her heart. "The danger is over, but the healing, that's just beginning. And you won't be doing it alone." For the next hour, officers, lawyers, and even the judge came out one by one just to check on her. Not because it was required, but because something about Lily had touched them all. They had seen the power of innocence standing against danger, the strength of a bond between human and animal, and the courage hidden in the smallest acts. When Lily finally left the courthouse that day, she stepped into the sunlight with her shoulders a little straighter. Valor walked beside her, his tail swaying gently. For the first time since losing her mother, she felt the warmth of hope against her skin. Not a loud hope, not a dramatic hope, just a quiet, steady one, like a candle that refuses to go out even when the wind tries to blow it away. As they crossed the parking lot, Lily reached down and held Valor's leash with her tiny hand. She looked up at the sky, wide, bright, endless, and whispered a promise only she and the dog would ever hear. "I'll be okay," she said. "Because you're here." Valor pressed close to her leg, as if to say he already knew. And in that moment, something inside Lily, something crushed, something wounded, began to knit itself back together, thread by fragile thread. Months later, Lily testified again, this time in a small private room with only the judge, the prosecutor, a counselor, and Valor. She spoke slowly, haltingly, but she spoke. She told the truth. Not to punish, not to seek revenge, but because doing so meant her mother's story would not disappear. Her voice trembled, but Valor rested his paw on her foot every time she faltered, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't the frightened child hiding behind a dumpster anymore. When the trial ended, the judge called Lily to his chambers. He handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a medal engraved with the words, "For courage beyond words." She looked up at him, confused. "It's not for the dog," the judge said gently. "It's for you." Lily's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't born of fear. They were born of pride, of grief transforming into something stronger, of the realization that even small voices can hold enormous power. Valor barked softly, as if cheering for her. Years later, people still talked about the day a silent little girl stopped a courtroom with a single signal to her dog. They talked about the judge who believed her without needing her to speak. They talked about the bond between a child and a dog that changed the course of justice. But Lily would remember it differently. She would remember the moment she chose trust over fear. The moment she decided to face the darkness of her past so she could step into the light of her future. The moment she realized that she wasn't powerless, even when she felt small. Because bravery, she learned, isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision, made quietly, sometimes in a whisper, to keep going anyway. And that is how a little girl with trembling hands and a silent voice taught an entire courtroom what courage truly looks like.